In previous video, we learned how to create table and enforce foreign key constraints. We kept ID as primary key in both tables, which help us to uniquely identify each record. In TBL gender column is not null, therefore it is mandatory while insertion. In TBL person, name and email is not null, therefore both are mandatory. But gender ID is foreign key. It means it can be any valid ID from TBL gender or null. Let's simulate this concept by adding some data in TBL person. So, by default, gender ID will be null. As gender ID is nullable, so I am ignoring it. As we did not supply gender ID value, it stores its default value, which is null. What if I want to keep default value other than null? The answer is default constraint. To add default constraint, here is the SQL query. Alter table TBL person. Add constraint, and then the constraint name. And then the type of the constraint, which is default, then default value, which is 3 for column gender ID. Before executing this query, expand constraints folder. As you can see, there is no constraint now. But once we execute this query, it should be there. Press F5 or hit execute. Command completed successfully. Right-click on Constraints folder and hit refresh. Here is the default constraint for gender ID column of TBL person. Now, if you perform select operation on both tables, you can see TBL person contains 7 records while Rich's gender ID is null. Let's change the data to get rid of confusion. In this query, we still not providing gender ID. So, it should get 3 as default gender ID using define default constraint. Press F5 or hit execute. 1 row affected. Execute select queries again. Look, gender ID is not null but 3 now. What if I provide the gender ID? Let's modify some data. In this case, as I provided the gender ID, default constraint will not apply. Press F5 or hit execute. Execute select queries again. Now, you can see that gender ID is what I provided while insertion. Let's try another use case. In this scenario, I have provided gender ID value as null. Let's see whether it's accepting null or enforcing default constraint. Press F5 or hit execute. Execute select queries again. Look for Johnny, gender ID is null, which we supplied while insertion. So, finally we got the idea that default constraint will only apply when we miss or skip the value. It will not enforce when we provide value explicitly. To drop this constraint, drop statement is used. Here is the drop constraint query. Alter table TBL person. Drop constraint and then the name of the constraint. Press F5 or hit execute. Command executed successfully. Right-click Constraints folder and hit refresh. Default constraint is deleted now.